So, welcome, Philip Reeve.
Hello.
So, Philip, writer, artist first, weren't you?
Yeah, well, illustrator.
Illustrator.
Yes, yes. Yeah,
It's an artist.
Well, it is sort of. I was tomorrow. I'm in the early slot again, and tomorrow I'm planning to talk about all sorts of things that influenced me when I was growing up and turned me into the writer that I became. And looking back, it was almost all visual stuff. When I was growing up, I drew all the time. I loved drawing, and I was very influenced by lots of sort of science fiction and fantasy illustrators when I was at a formative age. And I sort of aimed to be an illustrator and eventually became one. And I did a lot of cartoons for things like horrible histories, that kind of book, sort of illustrated non-fiction books. So that was my kind of bread and butter for about 10 years or so. And then while I was doing that, I was also writing kind of as a hobby in my spare time, and eventually managed to finish something and get it published. So I was an illustrator to start.
I noticed that when you signed your first book. You didn't just sign his name, but usually a picture of it somewhere.
Yeah, well, yeah, I can never think of anything witty to write. All the other authors can't. It's fantastic. Sort of a lot of little phrases that I put in. I can never think of anything to for fiction instead. It's much easier.
So, you first kicked off with Mortal Engines,
Yes.
first book.
Yes.
Yeah,
let me. The best way to.
Has anybody read Mortal Engines?
Yeah.
Okay.
The best way to sort of explain it, the world in which it's set, is probably to read the first bit. It took years and years to write. It was sort of my hobby all the time I was illustrating, so I went through many different versions and completely changed many times over, but it always pretty much started off with this scene. It was a dark, blustery afternoon in spring, and the city of London was chasing a small mining town across the dried-out bed of the old North Sea. In happier times, London would never have bothered with such feeble prey. The great traction city had once spent its days hunting far bigger towns than this, ranging north as far as the edges of the iced waste and south to the shores of the Mediterranean. But lately, prey of any kind had started to grow scarce, and some of the larger cities had begun to look hungrily at London. For 10 years now it had been hiding from them, skulking in a damp, mountainous western district, which the Guild of Historians said had once been the island of Britain. For 10 years it had eaten nothing but tiny farming towns and static settlements in those wet hills. Now at last the Lord Mayor had decided that the time was right to take his city back over the land bridge into the great hunting ground. It was barely halfway across when the lookouts on the high watchtowers spied the mining town, gnawing at the salt flats 20 miles ahead. To the people of London it seemed like a sign from the gods, and even the Lord Mayor, who didn't believe in gods or signs, thought it was a good beginning to the journey east and issued the order to give chase. The mining town saw the danger and turned tail, but already the huge caterpillar tracks under London were starting to roll faster and faster. Soon the city was lumbering in pursuit, a moving mountain of metal which rose in 7 tiers like the layers of a wedding cake, the lower levels wreathed in engine smoke, the villas of the rich gleaming white on the higher decks, and above it all the cross on top of St. Paul's Cathedral glinting gold, 2,000 feet above the ruined earth. So that's how that kicks off. And yeah, it's set in a sort of far future world where civilization has collapsed and sort of been rebuilt, literally, because the towns have all been reconfigured as huge vehicles which chase each other about and catch each other and rip the smaller towns apart to make sort of new bits and pieces for the larger ones. It's called municipal Darwinism. And it came to me one lunch hour while I was in the middle of an illustration job. I thought, ooh, you could have a big city that chased other cities and ate them. And basically I ended up living off that for about 20 years. So it was quite a productive lunch hour, that one.
And the first one won an award, a Smarties Award.
Yes, which was, looking back, was quite important. It got the Smarties Award, and then the following year, because awards are strange, because by the time a book gets shortlisted for an award, you've kind of forgotten you've written it, because you're always on the next one, the one after. They're doing the previous year, usually. So just around the time the second book came out, it won the Blue Peter prize, which really made a difference. I think that probably kind of kept them, gave them the success they had.
What did way to start?
Well, kind of. It was the first step on the ladder that led from obscurity to slightly less obscurity and then back down into complete obscurity.
And you ended up here,
Yeah,
sorry
yes.
about that, really. So where did you go from there? What were your next ones?
When I was writing that, it was just, I was just trying to write a novel, basically. I didn't really have any great plans to launch a career or anything. I didn't see myself being a writer. I just had all these ideas, and I thought I wanted to gather them all together and put them into a book. And then once I got to a certain stage of writing it, I think when I set out, I thought, oh, well, I'll sort of have to publish this myself or something, maybe it's going to be interesting. And then after about 5 years working on it, I thought, well, maybe somebody will want it. And I thought it was a science fiction novel at that time. I didn't think it was a kid's book at all. So I sort of sent it out to various agents, none of whom even bothered replying, really. A couple of them got back and said there is no possible market for this book. So eventually I just took it to my, one of the publishers I worked for, an illustrator, and said, look, could you have a look at this? Because I thought if they say, no, it's rubbish, then I'd just give it on. But they said, oh no, we quite like that. We could use that. So I hastily rewrote it as a children's book by just lopping about 5 years off the age of the central characters. That was really the only change I made. And it was published. And I thought, hooray, great, it's out, it's finished, hurrah. And then they said, well, what's the next one going to be? When is volume 2 coming along? So I thought, well, I wish I hadn't killed everybody off now.
Well, you sort of didn't. Some of them, you managed to bring some of them back.
Well, yeah, well, sort of. Now, I always dislike it in fantasy and sci-fi where people come back from the dead, because it sort of cheapens, it kind of cheapens the whole business. I mean, to the sort of reductio ad absurdum point in Doctor Who, where they have these endless sort of lachrymose scenes these days where somebody's dying. Oh no, they've died, and you know that 5 minutes later they can be back, and it all means nothing. So I'm very wary of bringing people back from the dead. So a couple of characters, no, one character does manage to be sort of revivified in Mortal Engines, but it's a terrible mistake.
It is.
It really shouldn't have been done, and it's horrible. So yes, so I did still have a couple of surviving characters from the first book. So I kind of thought about this for 6 months. I realised that actually, they could just go off and have adventures with a whole new set of characters, and that would be good. It'd be like a sort of detective story where you have the central character who moves to different environments in each book. So I started work on a sequel, which took ages, and I wrote a whole sequel and then threw it away. And then I wrote another one called Predator's Gold, which I think is my favourite of those books, actually. I think it's my favourite of them all. The second book always seems to be quite a good one to write, I find. You've sort of done all the kind of the heavy lifting of building the world and setting it all up, and then you just get to kind of play for a bit. And then by the time you get to the third book, there are all sorts of plot strands that so you're kind of back having to do things.
Yeah.
You kind of have to do stuff in the first book to set the world up, and then you have to do stuff in the third book to get all these plots aligned. But in the second book, you can just muck about. So I did that in Predator's Gold and quite enjoyed it. And so then I set off the third, which was going to complete the trilogy, but it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So eventually it turned into 2 books. So it became the Mortal Engines Quartet. So that was definitely easy for a while. Yes.
You like writing for, or writing young adult characters rather than adult characters. There's another one, is Larklight, and the heroes are sort of about 13, 15, 16.
Well, it's sort of, I don't know, when I was a child, a lot of the books that I read were things like Rosemary Sutcliffe and Tolkien, and I suppose, the Ghouls and stuff. They weren't about children, they were about young adults, or kind of actual adults, but sort of setting out in life, but these were grown-ups. And I don't remember ever, feeling alienated by that in any way, but these days I think it's assumed that if you're writing a book for young people, you will have a young person at the centre of it. I don't know very many people who break that rule. There were a few. So yeah, that's it's kind of a convention really, that you have a young hero or heroine, or both, and that's fine. I can work with that, because the interesting, you can bring in as many other characters as you like and as many other points of view as you like. So it's not really a problem. Yes, the Larklight books were things that I did can't remember if it was just after I'd finished the fourth Mortal Engines book, or if I was actually writing both of them together at one stage. But Larklight was a series I did for another publisher, Bloomsbury, and it's sort of a Victorian scientific romance, only it isn't, because I know far less about science than the Victorians did, it turns out. So it's kind of a fantasy built around a sort of spacefaring Victorian society.
Wooden-hulled spaceships.
Wooden-hulled spaceships, and there's yes, it's basically based on two ideas. One is that Isaac Newton invented space travel. His interest in alchemy paid off big time in this world, and he invented space travel. So by the 1850s, the British Empire reaches all the way to Jupiter. And then the other idea is that everywhere in space there is life. It's kind of the clangers, basically. The big sort of Larklight is the clangers. So wherever you go in space, everybody can breathe because there's ether everywhere. And there are fish floating around out there, and whales and pigs, flying pigs. Oh yes, I had yes, I had. Yes, in your Victorian spaceship or space station, if you want to tidy up, get rid of all the crumbs and stuff, you just turn the gravity off, so everything floats up into the air, and then you open a little hutch and release the hover hogs, who are like little flying pink pigs, who propel themselves by farting. And they shoot around the room, farting away, and scoff all the drifting muffin crumbs and bits of tea cake and things.
When you signed the book, you put one of the
yes,
in,
yes.
and okay, I'm sure that means something. And I'm halfway through reading the book. Now I get it.
Yes, they're also very easy to draw. They're like sort of pear drops with a pink face at the front and the bark coming out the back. They have flippers, little flippers to steer themselves by instead of legs. But in all other ways, they look like cartoon pigs. So yeah, they were. I was quite pleased with the hover hogs. I was so pleased. I wish I could keep bringing them back in other things. Really, they don't have their own adventure.
Okay, there you go. Another story. I think the most audacious thing in Larklight was what you did to the Great Red Spot at Jupiter.
Oh right, yes. That turns out to be nobody. This is the first time anybody in my whole career has ever mentioned Larklight, actually, because I was saying to Gary last night, writing Larklight, it was like chucking stuff down a well. I'd write these books and put them out, and nobody. I don't think anybody. They were aimed at children and sold to children. And Bloomsbury, who published them, did a great job. They look fantastic. They've got beautiful illustrations by. Oh look, there is one. Yeah. Beautiful illustrations by David Wyatt. So the idea was, right from the start, that they would look like sort of artifacts that had come from this world in which they're set. They've got all these sort of adverts and things on the intakers. Thank you. But yeah, I gradually realised all the sort of little sort of Victorian details that I kind of knew somehow and was happy to cram into books. Children didn't know and weren't the least bit interested in. So it was kind of, I gradually felt this I was flogging the dead horse, and nobody ever really mentioned them, which is why I haven't bothered bringing a copy along. Otherwise, I could have bought PowerPoints of all the lovely pictures and stuff.
Always next year.
Yes, have a look at this copy if you can all queue up and have a peek at that, because David's pictures are really fantastic, and they're what kept me going on that video. And I'd only really had one, but the pictures were so great. I thought, we have to do some more of these, and I didn't know David when I wrote the first one, and then by the second one we were able to sit down and kind of collaborate more closely. So he's a great man. You should get him in actually, and do something chat.
We'll have a chat later. Yeah. Always like new places. It's a big green book right next to you, which I have to admit, when I first saw them, really stood out.
Yes, it's very green. Yeah, this one is. A few years ago, I read The Lord of the Rings to my son. He was probably a bit young. He was only about 7, there's so much of that stuff in the culture now. You see, it was sort of getting things like Warhammer and stuff like that, and it's all sort of basically riffing on the same stuff that Lord of the Rings is made of. And I thought, well, if I don't read it to him soon, he'll have, it will seem like old news to him. So I read him Lord of the Rings. And it was fantastic. It was a great thing to read aloud. And it reminded me how much I'd loved it when I was a child. And I'd never imagined writing kind of proper fantasy. It hadn't really, I'm not that interested in it, to be honest. I love Lord of the Rings. Can't be bothered with anything in the same genre. It doesn't really interest me at all. I don't see the need for it, because I think it's just been done as well as it could be, and it's finished. And then I thought, well, actually, the thing about fantasy is that it kind of, or the fantasy I've come across, doesn't really have very many poo jokes in it. So I thought there's a kind of niche there that I could inhabit. It's kind of high fantasy poo jokes, and so that became goblins, because these seem to me to be the things that appeal to boys, goblins and poo jokes. So I came up with this thing. The other thing about Lord of the Rings, of course, is that all the goblins and orcs, they're all evil, and they're just evil because they're evil. That seems a bit unfair to me. There must be some goblins who I kind of imagined. I think the first idea came from this. I imagined, what if in the you have this sort of huge dark army of orcs marching out of Mordor or somewhere, and one of the orcs is Woody Allen, and he's going, "What am I doing in this army?" He just wants to go home, he just wants to get out of there. So that kind of sparked off a little idea. And I had this notion that, I should write a fantasy where the goblins get to be, maybe not good, but they're all right, we can understand them. There are nice goblins and nasty goblins. There are a few bad apples, but basically they're okay. So that's where goblins came from. It's a fantasy from the goblins' point of view. It's gradually, I don't really plan books out, they kind of accrete slowly over years and years and years. And this one, I started out writing a kind of sort of traditional fantasy quest with people wandering around all over a big landscape, and I had no idea where they were going or what they were after. But they all seemed to be heading somewhere called Clovenstone, which was this abandoned dark castle that had once been the preserve of some evil sorcerer. And as I was writing, gradually I started thinking, well, actually, Clovenstone sounds like the most interesting thing in this book. So I chucked the whole thing away, and I started again, and I set it all in Clovenstone this time, which is, it's this vast sort of abandoned castle with a kind of ruined city around it. I like the idea that the great clash between good and evil has been sorted out before this book starts. It's all over. The Dark Lord has been defeated years and years ago. But in the ruins of his castle, some of the goblins who had once been his armies still exist, and they're kind of all looking out for themselves now, and have made this little society of their own. Should I read it? Yeah. Yes. I'll read from the start. That seems to be the best way, because you have spoilers.
You have good starts as well.
In the lands of the West, where men are few and some of the old magic lingers still, there stands the ancient fortress of Clovenstone. A wide wall rings it, tumbled now and overgrown with weeds. The trees and waters of the wild have crept inside and made their home again, among its steep, deserted streets and crumbling buildings. At its heart a crag rises, Meneth Eskern, most westerly of the Bone Hill Mountains, and on the summit stands a black keep, tall as the sky, with sheer walls and horns of stone. Around this dark tower, like a stone crown on the crag's brow, there runs a lofty inner wall, guarded by 7 lesser towers. All are in ruins now, the men who raised them long since gone. Crows caw about their sagging roofs, and gargoyles lurk in their ivy like lice in beggars' beards. The highest of these 7 towers is called the Black Spike. Although it is dwarfed by the great mass of the keep behind it, it is still taller than any tower in the lands of men. From its snow-flecked battlements to the ground at the crag's foot is a very long drop indeed. And that was bad news for Scarpa, because he had just been catapulted off the top of it. Ah! He screamed, rising up, pausing a moment, flailing for handholds on the empty air, and then beginning his long fall. Ah! But after the first 1,000 feet or so, he realised that he was just going, from force of habit. So he stopped. And from then on, the only sounds were the whooshing of the cold air past his ears, and the occasional cottony rustle as a cloud shot by. Of course, it's not so much the falling that bothers me, thought Scarpa, as the ivied stones and mean little windows of the Black Spike rushed past him. It's the hitting the ground that's the trouble. Below him, now that he had got used to the feeling that the wind was pushing its thumbs into his eyes, he could see plump white clouds dotting the middle air like sheep. Below them, the bleak buttresses of Meneth Eskern spread out like the fingers of a splayed stone hand, with ruined buildings clustering between them. This was Scarpa's world, and as he looked down upon it, he was interested to notice several details that Stenorian's map of all Clovenstone had got wrong. but not that interested, because the details were rushing towards him at great speed. And long before he could tell anyone of his discoveries, he was going to be splattered all over them like a careless delivery of raspberry jam. That's the beginnings of Scums. Of course, he doesn't end up splattered all over them. I started writing this on the train to London one day. I started in Newton Abbot station, and by the time I got to Paddington, I kind of had like the beginnings of a story, which is always quite, that was a productive train journey. But I sort of set myself like a little challenge to keep myself interested of seeing how long I could keep him falling for before he had to hit the ground or be rescued in an unlikely way. And so he sort of falls and falls, and then he flashes back and we go all the way back through his childhood and how he came to be in this terrible situation. And I think it's about page 36 or something. Before, it is, page 36, he is rescued in an unlikely manner and sets off on adventures and discovers all sorts of other strange creatures lurking in the ruins of Wodenstone, and adventures develop. And I tried to fit in, I tried to sort of tick all the fantasy boxes. There are wizards and princesses and giants and
in a slightly different way.
Well, yeah, I mean, always, with all this stuff, I'm always trying to kind of recreate the things I enjoyed as a child. But I don't want to just recreate them, you kind of have to try and put a bit of a spin on it. So I have this, there's a young hero who's arriving in Wodenstone because he's heard this the song of Princess Eluned, who has been kidnapped by a giant and is held captive in one of the old towers. And he's fought his way across the wastelands to Wodenstone so that he can come and rescue her and be a hero. But when he gets there, it turns out this song, he said, is really old. So she's kind of a grown-up princess. She's about 60 or something. So which again, just sort of makes it not the character you expect to meet. So I always try and tweak things a little bit like that. Which goes back to Mortal Engines as well. It sort of is a kind of an action movie, but it's got an ugly heroine and a useless hero and quite a nice villain. So it's I don't know. It just hopefully makes it more interesting.
Because in the sequel, you made the dwarves bad guys.
Yes, there is. Again, none of these things. I never planned these things as series, but they seem to turn into them. And the second Goblins one, it's called Goblins versus Dwarves. Yes, so having sort of set the goblins up as sort of quite nice, really, and all right. Then they meet some dwarves, and the dwarves are kind of bad guys who want to mine under their castle and take all their stuff. And so they go looking for help. It's Nick basically from the Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven. They go off to seek help from the king, the human king, who will send heroes to protect them. They think because all their precious metals are being nicked by the dwarves. But of course, the king has heard all the stories about how dwarves are good and loyal and hardworking, and goblins are evil. So he doesn't believe a word of it. So once again, they have to sort out their own destiny. So yeah, it's just really doing quite obvious little tweaks on fantasy traditions. Which probably loads of other people have already tweaked for themselves, but I haven't lived those, so I don't know.
Well, thank you for bum cakes.
Bum cakes? Oh yeah, well you have my son to thank for that. That's something he used to...
So it's a swear word. Working in a school, you get swears, and I have to find words that are not going to get me sacked. And bum cakes is a good one.
Well, it's most of the same,
inoffensive, and if the boys hear it, they'll just laugh.
Yes. It's very good, and it serves the purpose of a swear word.
Yeah.
It's sort of relieved tension. Bum cakes. And this is also a problem if you're writing for children. One of the things, you can do pretty much anything these days, I think, in a children's book or a YA book. One of the things that is still quite controversial is swearing. Which is a problem if you're trying to write something sort of set in gritty everyday reality, because if you listen to small children talking these days, it's like The Wire. It's every time, but you can't do that in a children's book. But that's not a problem for me because I'm making up my own worlds, so I can make up my own swear words as well. And in Mortal Engines, I got rounded by any friends of mine with sort of vaguely interesting names became gods in the world of Mortal Engines. I have a friend called Nick Quirk, so he became the great god of London's Quirk. And of course, in moments of stress, people would say, "Oh, for Quirk's sake!" And Poskett, yes, John Poskett, who's a writer I've illustrated for in the past. He also became a god, and Poskett is a very good swear. So inventing swear words is kind of one of the good bits. Inventing names, inventing swear words are the nice bits of writing this stuff. All the rest of it's just hard work, but coming up with names and swears.
And then you mind back into the Mortal Engines for all the Fever Crom stuff.
Yes, I kind of, I kind of thought that Mortal Engines was done and dusted, really. I thought it was all finished when I did 4, and I really didn't want it turning into a kind of soap opera thing that goes on and on and on. So I very carefully tried to kind of tie off every loose end at the end of the 4th book, and moved on. But it kind of was my world, really. I'd spent a long time creating that, and it was stuffed full of all the stuff that I was interested in at the time. So I kept kind of coming up with new ideas and new names that sort of belonged in that world, more people and more places. So eventually I went back into the prequel called Fever Crom, which kind of goes right back, hundreds of years before Mortal Engines, back to the very origins of how this world of moving cities kind of developed, because it's never explained in Mortal Engines. You just sort of dumped into it, and there are a few hints given to where it came from. But I thought it might be quite interesting to go back and see if I could sort of back engineer it. And also I got a bit more interested in science. I think when I did Mortal Engines I was very determined that it was a fantasy, and I wasn't the least bit interested in how anything worked. But then in Fever Crom I started to think, well actually, how does that work? How would you make a city move? So it's still fairly hand-wavy, but it's a bit more rigorous. And Fever Crom herself, it was the heroine of the first book, and 2 sequels as well. She lives in this sort of post-apocalyptic London, which is kind of sunk back to sort of Elizabethan levels of squalor and superstition. But she's been raised by scientists, or engineers at least, who are they're a bit like Vulcans. They're very, very determined to expunge all emotion from their lives and be very logical and rigorous. So I quite like the idea of having this terribly sort of prim and logical and she tries to be a very unfeeling young woman, and then setting her adrift in this world of kind of madness and chaos and lunatics. So it was hellish to write. Actually. It was really difficult to write, and was aborted on several occasions because when you're trying to write a prequel, it kind of has to feature all the things that happen in the later books, but you don't want it to kind of just eat up the backstory. It mustn't just feature those things. It kind of has to be its own self as well. So it took a lot of doing, and I didn't really like it because it had been such hard work. I think of all the books I've written, it was probably the most difficult. But I looked back at it recently for some reason, and I thought it was okay. Actually, I think it's one of my better efforts. So yeah, that happened, and the idea was that there would be four Fever Crom books to kind of balance the 4 Mortal Engines books on the great seesaw of literary endeavour. They ought to, should be 4 of each, but it never really happened, unfortunately. I got the 3, and it kind of all had, it got Firefly. It petered out at that point. So,
I'm looking forward to reading it. But you've got new books out.
Yes.
Changed tack a little.
Yeah, well, the not being able to do the 3rd, because till now my career has been, has been kind of all right, really. I've just been writing the books I wanted to do, and people published it, and that was fine. But not being able to do the 4th Fever Crom book was kind of a blow. And then at the same time, the publisher of Mortal Engines, they'd been tinkering with the covers for a long time, and I think the original covers that they had on them were really very good, and these are very popular, and people like these. But, the publishers have marketing departments, and marketing departments have to justify their existence by constantly refreshing the covers of books. So they've been kind of rejacketing Mortal Engines kind of about once every 6 months for a number of years. And sort of inventing new series titles for it and things until nobody, including me, knew what it was actually called. And eventually they came up with a set of covers that were so repellent that kind of sales just went boom. And I used to come to things like this, and people would sort of queue up. I would sell like 20, 25 copies of Mortal Engines, and then I found that I was coming to things like this, and people would queue up and go, where can I get the old ones with the nice covers? And all I was doing was selling second-hand copies on Amazon. So it was kind of depressing. And I thought I should give up. I thought, I kind of ridden this writing wave as far up the beach as it's going to go. I'm going to knock off and go back to illustration. So I scuffed around and sorted out a couple more illustration contracts for myself. But I befriended an illustrator called Sarah McIntyre. I met her at the Edinburgh Festival a couple of years back. And we sort of hit it off. For some reason, despite being, I think, to all outward appearances, complete opposites in every way. She's very sort of extrovert and fun, and I'm very dour and quiet and gloomy. And she writes kind of picture books and mad little comics for small children. And I wrote these kind of big, gloomy, serious, or well, not really serious, but you know, quite sort of old-fashioned novels. But for some reason, we just hit it off, and we decided we needed to work together. And I realised that this was, this was Career 2 had arrived. There it was, waiting for me, so that was fine. I hopped aboard Career 2, and off we went. And we came up with this book called Oliver and the Seawigs. I'd had an idea, for a long time I wanted to do a sort of a sea fantasy, a kind of, the old Celtic notion of the islands of the blessed, these sort of magical islands. I think it exists in lots of cultures, actually, this idea that magical islands that appear and disappear, and you could go and visit them, and strange things would happen there. So I'd, for a long time, been sort of vaguely toying with the idea of doing a book about that, and it had never come off. So we kind of got together on that story, and it's nothing to do with the Islands of the Blessed or anything like that at all. It's a potty story about rambling islands who are basically like big stony giants who wander around the ocean, and what they do is collect all the flotsam that drifts about on the tide, and they pile it up on their heads to make sea wigs. And it all came from, Sarah is on the Children's Writers and Illustrators group, which is part of the Society of Authors, and the acronym for that is Seawigs. Seawigs. And she said one morning, I'm off to a Seawigs meeting, and we kind of went, ding, Seawigs. So that's where the notion of the islands piling stuff on their heads came from, and we've got a kind of a whole story that ambles around them. And it's obviously shorter than things I'd have written before, and I suppose it's aimed at that kind of children of that age when they're too old to read picture books. They want a bit more of a challenging story, but at the same time they still want lots and lots of pictures. So I think there was sort of a niche to be filled again there. So it is. I mean, Sarah is just a joy to work with, and it's a beautifully illustrated thing. And when I was working with David Wyatt on the Larklight books, it was kind of a more traditional setup. I would write the book, and then he would do the pictures, and we talk a bit about it, but it was pretty much a writer-illustrator relationship, whereas Oliver and the Seaweeds, it's a double act completely. I mean, Sarah comes up with at least half the ideas, and if I'll do most of the writing, but then if I get stuck, I'll just Skype her, and she'll go, sea monkeys, or something, and then I have to write those in. So it's a completely different experience, really. It's being part of a team. When we do events, and we do a lot of events together, and that's a joy too, because we can do this kind of double act thing on stage. So, whereas I used to do these kind of chin-strokey things where I'd stand there and people would say, where do you get your ideas from? Now we're kind of singing and dancing and drawing and doing all sorts of malarkey. Let me see if I can find the Sea Monkeys page, because they're rather spectacular. Yes, when we do these stage events, we always start off, she says, I'm Philip Reeve, and I say, I'm Sarah McIntyre. And that's quite a good icebreaker if you've got an audience of small children, because they'll go, no. But it's also, in a way, sort of, in a strange way, it's kind of, it's a way of kind of escaping from my former role. I am no longer Philip Reeve who write all these books. I am now one half of Reeve and McIntyre who writes these. So there's a great sort of sense of freedom to that. It's a great sense that, oh yeah, okay, I've abandoned all that and I'm moving on, and I've got a new career in a new town. And sea monkeys. So I haven't got any books with me to sell, unfortunately, this weekend, because I've done so many things where I take books along and nobody buys any. And I didn't have a car yesterday, so I couldn't really drag them down the train. But these copies of The Cakes in Space and Oliver and the Seaweeds I could sell if anyone wants them, and perhaps we could auction, perhaps, yes, or something. Anyway.
Now you're doing a new one.
Yes.
Yes. Something a little more serious.
Oh yes, yes. Sorry. Oh yeah. Sorry. There's a second reading back into that. I ought to say, which is Cakes in Space, which is sort of the closest.
I need to dip out.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Cakes in Space is the closest I've ever come to writing hard science fiction. I kind of like the idea of writing a really sort of cold, mechanistic, sort of 2001-ish kind of science fiction spaceship story, and then getting Sarah to illustrate it with all her lovely little kind of beautiful little cartoons. So, so the first part of the story is it's about a girl who's setting off with her family to colonise a new planet, and so you see them taking the space shuttle up into orbit, where this huge spacecraft is waiting to take them on their interstellar journey. But there's no gravity on board; everybody floats around, it's one of these sort of 2001 alien deals where you're in a cryogenic freezer for the whole journey. So I think it may be the first time cryogenic freezers have appeared in a book for the sort of 5 to 9 age group, and so yeah, she goes to sleep in her freezer, and then wakes up 100 years later, halfway through the voyage, and she's the only one awake. The seed for this book was that idea really of when you're little and you're awake, you're the only one who's awake in the house. It's kind of magic, and it's a little bit scary. And I quite like the idea of this girl. I just sort of had this image of this girl floating around this spaceship on her own while everyone else is asleep. Sort of great silence. But that would have been boring. So she discovers that the ship's food-making machine has gone wrong and is turning out generation after generation of mutant killer cakes. So she is then responsible for saving the ship from these banged cakes. So it's aliens with cakes, basically, and that's our second one. And I was quite pleased we managed to stop Oliver and the Seaweeds turning into a series. I really didn't want to do Oliver and the Seaweeds, Oliver and something else, Oliver and something else. So we were very, very determined. I think my first career was kind of, I had it by accident really. I had no idea what I was doing, and it kind of turned out the publisher didn't really either. So this second one, I hope being a little bit more, I'm kind of a little bit more aware of the pitfalls. So I'm not doing series, so nobody can firefly this one because there isn't a book 3 to cancel under me. So the second one is completely different. It's about as different as it could be from Oliver and the Seaweeds. And then the next one we're doing is called Pugs of the Frozen North. And please don't tweet that because I think it's a secret. And that's about a sled race in the Arctic with pugs. And then the fourth one will be something different again. So yeah, I have this sort of this new life of McIntyre madness has opened up, and it's really good. I must say, I'm really enjoying it. And yes, I'm enjoying it so much that I kind of thought, writing is quite fun. I'd sort of forgotten that. I'd forgotten how much it does feel quite good writing a whole book. So I kind of started looking back through some other ideas I'd had and thinking again, and I embarked on a new novel on sort of Mortal Engines scale. Although it's not, it's set in the future again, but in a very, very high-tech future. So it is actually the most sci-fi thing I've ever done. It's set in a vast galactic empire. Only I found spaceships quite difficult to write. When I set out writing this thing, I was sort of thinking back to sort of Star Wars and Blake 7 and things like that I loved when I was 12 or 13. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to have loads of spaceships. They'll be great to write. But actually, no, they're not. It's very, very hard to write a spaceship that isn't exactly like somebody else's spaceship. And they take ages to get anywhere, because I was trying to do it without hyperspace or breaking the laws of physics, basically. So it's all set in one solar system, and people travel from planet to planet. But the trouble is, even if you allow for whizzy futuristic engines, it still took them ages to get from one planet to another. And as soon as you turn your engine on, everybody knows where you're going, which kind of sort of rather takes the edge off all the sort of kind of excitement that you kind of need in an adventure story. So I thought, oh well, I'm going to have to have wormholes or something. I'm going to have some way of breaking the laws of physics. I'm going to have to do hyperspace or wormholes. And then I thought, well, if you have wormholes, you wouldn't need spaceships, really, would you? You could just go through them in a train. So it's become a train-based. All my spaceships turn into trains, and it's become a completely train-based science fiction story. I don't know if you can see these. I did have a PowerPoint screen, but it's not linked to the projector. So those are the outfits that Sarah and I like to wear when we're doing our stage shows together.
We'll show them tomorrow.
Yeah, you'll see them tomorrow. I'll have a proper projector there. But yeah, that's one of the other good things about working with Macintyre is that I get to dress up. Oh, and we get to dress other people up as well, because when you're at a book festival and you're wearing a huge strange wig, other people come over to try it on. So there's Neil Gaiman wearing Sarah's. So now, why was I doing this? Yes, I wasn't. I was looking for. Shall I read you a bit of this new one? This is the first time it's ever actually been heard in public, and I'm kind of trying to keep quiet about it, really, because I don't want to. It's not going to be published until next autumn, so I don't want to kind of have everybody.
So maybe in time for Armadacon 27?
Yeah, certainly in time for Armadacon 27. I shall come along next year with a stack of it.
With books.
With books, yeah. It's called Railhead, and this is how it begins. Listen. He was running down Harmony when he heard it, faint at first but growing clearer, rising above the noises of the streets. Out in the dark, beyond the city, a siren voice was calling, lonely as the song of whales. It was the sound he had been waiting for. Train song. The Interstellar Express was thundering down the line from Golden Junction and singing as it came. He had an excuse to hurry now. He was not running away from a cryon anymore, just running to catch a train. Just Zen Starling, a thin brown kid racing down Harmony Street with trouble in his eyes and stolen jewellery in the pocket of his coat, dancing his way through the random gaps that opened and closed in the crowds. The lines of lanterns strung between the old glass buildings lit his face as he looked back, checking for the drone that was hunting him. Amberseye Station, grand and high-fronted like a great theatre, with the K-Bahn logo hanging over its entrance in letters of blue fire. Booming loudspeaker voices reciting litanies of stations, moths and monk bugs swarming under the lamps outside, beggars and street kids too, and buskers and vendors selling fruit and chai and noodles, and rickshaw captains squabbling as they touted for fares. Through the din and chatter came the sound of the train pulling in. Zen went through the entrance barriers and ran out onto the platform. The express was just pulling in. This is a rough version. I'm going to have to change that because it says pulling in twice. First, the huge loco, a Heldon hammerhead, its long hull sheathed in shining red gold scales. Then a line of lit windows, wet with alien rain. A pair of station angels went flickering along the carriage sides like stray rainbows, and some tourists standing next to Zen pointed at them and snapped pictures which wouldn't come out. The train stopped. Zen kept his place in the scrum of other K-Bahn travellers, itching to look behind him, but knowing that he mustn't, because if the drone were there, it would be watching for just that, a face turned back, a look of guilt. The doors slid open. He shoved past disembarking passengers into a carriage. It smelled of something sweet, as if the train had come from some world where it was springtime. Zen found a window seat and sat there looking at his feet, at the ceramic floor, at the patterns on the worn seat coverings, anywhere but out of the window, which was where he most wanted to look. His fellow passengers were commuters and a few motoric couriers with their android brains stuffed full of information for businesses further down the line. In the seats opposite Zen lounged a couple of rich kids, railheads from Kumbusi or Galagast, pretty as 3D stars, dozing with their arms around each other. Zen thought about taking their bags with him when he got off, but his luck was glitchy tonight and he decided not to risk it. The train began to move, so smoothly that he barely noticed. Then the lights of Amberseye Station were falling behind, the throb of the engines was rising, the snare drum backbeat of the wheels quickening. Zen risked a glance at the window. At first it was hard to make out anything in the confusion of carriage reflections and the city lights sliding by outside. Then he saw the drone again. It was keeping pace with the train, shards of light sliding from its rotor blades as it burred along at window height, training a whole spider cluster of eyes and cameras and who knew what at him. Then the train rushed into a tunnel, and he could see nothing anymore except his own skinny reflection, wide cheekbones fluttering with the movement of the train, eyes big and empty as the eyes on moth's wings. The train accelerated, the noise rising, until with a soundless bang, a kind of unbang, it tore through the K-gate, and everything got reassuringly weird. For a time this moment Zen was outside of the universe. There was a sense of falling, although there was no longer any down to fall to. Something that was not quite light blazed in through the blank windows. Then another unbang, and the train was sliding out of another ordinary tunnel, slowing towards another everyday station. It was bright daytime on this world, and the gravity was lower. Zen relaxed into his seat, grinning. He was imagining that drone turning away in defeat from the empty tunnel on Amberseye, 1,000 light years away. So that's kind of the beginning of the new one. I skipped a bit, but there we go. that's what I'm working on at the moment, basically. Still rewriting, tinkering with that, and that will be out next autumn. So that kind of brings us up to date, I guess.
So, any questions?
Yes.
Please.
Did the publisher go back to the original picture on Mortal Engines recently? Because that's the old one, isn't it?
That's the old one, yeah.
So that's got either an old copy or they reissued the old picture?
No, they haven't. There were various different editions of that with that picture on, but no, they haven't used that for about 6 or 7 years now, I think. There've been other covers since.
But the sales are still low? Or
I don't know, to be honest. Which you know, I don't pay that much attention to sales because it sounds stupid. You know, once I've done it, it's gone, and kind of, you know, sometimes you have a good year and some royalties come in, and sometimes you have a less good year and fewer royalties come in. But really, you know, I'm interested in writing the next book, and I just want them to do well enough that somebody will publish the next one, basically, all the time. So I don't spend a lot of time checking my sort of sales rankings and stuff like that at all.
And do you do your own illustrations ever?
No. There was one. I did one book called No Such Thing as Dragons, which is a very short sort of historical fantasy, and that was supposed to be illustrated by David Wyatt, but he was too busy, so I did some chapter heads for that. And then Goblins I wanted to illustrate myself, but and I sort of sold it on the idea that I was going to illustrate it myself, but then when it came round, there'd been some change of thinking at the top, and they said, "Oh no, we don't want your pictures in here." But you know, I think that was probably a good thing, because in the time that I would have spent illustrating Goblins, I've written a couple of other books, and Dave Semple, who did these pictures, is great. I mean, I think that is really striking. And the second one again is very good green writing, and they're very, very, you know, they stand out across the bookshop, these books. So you know, it wasn't what I planned, but I think he did a better job than I could have done. So no, I never have done my own illustrations really. I might do in the future at some point. I'm doing at the moment for Oxford educational wing. I'm doing a retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I might do some pictures to go with that. I think if they'll have them.
With a twist?
No, actually, no. It's a pretty straight. It's going to be a pretty straight retelling because it's part of a series of great stories. I think they're publishing a series about great stories from around the world, and they asked me if I'd do one, and I thought I've got a kind of connection to the Arthurian legend. It was quite important to me when I was growing up. We forgot to mention, of course, Here Lies Arthur, which is my one kind of technically non-fantasy or sci-fi novel. It's kind of it sort of claims to be a historical novel, and this is supposedly the story of the real King Arthur, who, a bit like Terry Pratchett's Robin Hood, who we were talking about earlier, it turns out to be just a thug with a good spin doctor. King Arthur is a gangster, basically. He's sort of a minor 5th century warlord, but he has a spin doctor who's basically Merlin, who tells all these stories about him to make him seem much bigger and more important and better than he actually is. And the story is about a girl who becomes Merlin's apprentice and sort of takes part in the creation of what we know as the Arthurian legend. So that's a very sort of a very non-traditional King Arthur story. I kind of when I was writing it, I was sort of thinking, well, there's sort of revisionist westerns from the 70s, where, you know, all the cowboys and heroes of the old western movies turn out to be sort of psychopaths and grubby drunks and things, and I kind of wanted to give it that kind of spin. So I thought it would be only fair to go and do a proper Arthurian retelling, and I'm going to do Gawain straight, and possibly with some of my illustrations, because I live up on Dartmoor and I spend a lot of time drawing landscapes and things up there, so I thought I could maybe put that to use.
One at the back? Is that a question?
Well, I was going to ask if you'd ever considered writing dialogues, and I suppose I wasn't here at the beginning, so I didn't hear the start of the talk, but what motivated you to write for children than adults?
I sort of touched on it earlier on when you probably weren't here, but Mortal Engines, when I started writing it, I thought it was a science fiction novel, and I assumed it would be published, you know, by, I don't know, Tor or something as an adult sci-fi novel. But nobody wanted it, so I took it to a children's publisher instead. And at that point, I sort of discovered that I think I'd assumed it would be sort of too dark and too, maybe not too dark, but certainly sort of, it's quite complicated, it's quite stuffed with ideas and stuff, and I thought it would be too complex for a children's book. But I discovered that actually you can kind of pretty much do whatever you like in children's books. There are plenty of people doing far darker and more complicated things than I do. It's never occurred to me really to leave that world now. I can do what I like there. So I've pretty much stuck with it. And of course, having sort of built a bit of a name in one field, it would be, you know, foolish perhaps to go off and start again with another one. When I was writing Railhead again, Railhead was very much like going back to the beginning of Mortal Engines, because I didn't know, I was writing it on spec, I didn't know it was ever going to be published, and I didn't really know if it was going to be for adults or children, but again, a children's publisher made a good offer for it as a YA novel, so it's that's what it's going to be. Anyone else? Yes.
Did you say when the Pugs book might be?
That will be next September. Yes, that's next week.
I haven't typed it down.
Oh really? Oh well, this is the book for you. The thing is that these things, because they're quite short, they take me about sort of a month to write, and then poor old Sarah McIntyre has to spend about 6 months slaving over hot illustrations to get them ready. So she's just embarked on that process at the moment. They'll be ready in September. But the Pugs are magnificent. So, but yes, that's right. News must seep out soon about it.
It'll leak. We've still got at least half 15 minutes, so.
Could you just keep reading from your...
Well, yeah, I can read you some more if you like. Yes. What, from which would you do? Goblin.
Goblin. Find out what helps to scarf.
Okay.
Get to page 36.
Right, so
shall I, you've got to probably go out 15 minutes, and if you read until you get bored, or they all leave.
Okay.
I'll move away.
Okay, right. So we've got to about what sort of...
Yeah, I'd say 1:45. It's probably enough time to find out about the Scarf's background.
Okay. Right, so more goblins.
He's going to come back next year and bring books.
Wait till next year.
Well, I've talked to Philip with a bunch of postage. We talked to Waterstones and they're not interested in sending in books.
No, we try. Right. So Scarpa's falling, and before he could tell anyone of his discoveries, he was going to be splattered all over them like a careless delivery of raspberry jam. Indeed, it was maps and books and things of that sort that were to blame for Scarpa being in this sticky situation in the first place. He felt quite bitter when he thought about it and glared fiercely at a passing crow. Scarpa was a goblin, as the crow guessed at once from his amber eyes, clawed paws, long flapping ears, and the tail that snapped behind him like a whip as he fell. There were goblins in all the 7 towers of Clovenstone. They were born of the stone of the mountains, and they had a fierce greed for gold and silver and other shining things, which they spent most of their time searching for in the ancient armories and storerooms, or stealing from each other and from the goblins of the other towers. There had been a time when all goblins had been servants of the same great sorcerer, the Lich Lord, who had raised Clovenstone and ruled the whole world from his stone throne high in the keep. But years without number had passed since the Lich Lord's army was defeated at the Battle of Dorkoth by the armies of the kings of men, and for as long as any living goblin could recall, each of the 7 towers had been home to a separate goblin gang. Sometimes the gangs from 2 or 3 different towers would form an alliance, and go roaring out of Clovenstone to raid the fisherfolk and miners of the little man kingdoms along the nibbled coast. But they were untrustworthy creatures, and their alliances didn't last. It was never long before they were fighting each other over the loot, safe in their home towers again, with the entrances blocked up by barricades of rubble and old furniture. Blackspike Tower, where Scarpa lived, or had lived until he was catapulted off its roof that morning, was ruled by a large and dangerous goblin named King Nobbler, and the goblins who lived in it were called the Blackspike Boys. There were no crueler raiders, greedier hoarders, or more ruthless robbers anywhere in Clovenstone. Fighting and loot was what they lived for. Fighting and loot and eating. Fighting and loot and eating, and then more fighting. Except for Scarpa. Scarpa was different. Old Breslaw had seen it as soon as Scarpa hatched. Breslaw was different too. He'd lost an eye, an ear, a leg, and most of his tail in a raid on the Nibbled Coast 40 years before. He was only half the goblin he used to be, and since he could no longer go out raiding with the rest of the tribe, King Nobbler had made him hatchling master. Once a year, on the night when the horns of the new moon seemed to rest on the summit of the keep, Breslaw would descend into the Black Spike's deep cellars, unlock a heavy cobweb-covered door, and steer his squeaking wheelbarrow down steep and lonely tunnels which plunged beneath the roots of Clovenstone into the dark under the mountains, where lay the lava lake. There, in the cauldrons of the earth, the restless, silvery hot magma roiled and churned. The lake spat out little gobs of lava, which hardened shiny black upon the walls and floors of its great cave. Once a year, it spat out something else as well, egg stones. Patiently, using a long-handed shovel, and wrapped in wet skins to save himself from being shriveled by the heat, old Breslaw would hobble back and forth along the hot shores, collecting the egg stones. Sometimes, through the fumes that hung above the lake, he could see the hatchling masters from other towers patrolling their own stretches of shoreline, but he did not interfere with them, or try to stop them gathering up their own egg stones. Each to his beach. That was one of the few scraps of the old law which all Clovenstone's goblins still obeyed. Nor did he try to peer up the great chimney holes which opened above the lake, and were supposed to reach right up inside the keep. When Breslaw was a younger goblin, the idea of getting inside the keep had kept him awake at night, but he'd long since come to accept that there was no way in. Mad Armadacons lads from Slate Top Tower had tried it once, creeping out over the lake on scaffolding made from old floorboards. The scaffolding had fallen apart and dropped into the lava before the goblins climbing it got anywhere near those black openings. So Breslaw just kept his eye on the basalt beach, and scooped up the dully glowing egg stones as they landed, and when they were all safely in his barrow, he trundled them back up the steep miles to his chamber high in Black Spike Tower, which was called the Hatchery. There he kept them warm beside his fire until they began to jiggle and to crack. The goblins who had hatched from the same batch of egg stones as Scarpa did not look alike. Earthborn creatures do not resemble each other in the way that members of a human family or a human race do. The sizes and shapes of Scarpa and his batch brothers had been decided by some strange whim of the earth itself. Some had scales and some had fur. Some had squashed-in snouts like pigs, others long pointed noses and trailing ears. Most had fangs and claws and beady black eyes in which a little gleam of vicious glee appeared when they kicked aside the fragments of their egg stones and saw the mini mallets and little training cudgels which Breslaw left leaning against the hatchery walls. With scratchy cries, they snatched the tiny weapons up and began belting each other over the head. Breslaw watched them and nodded in satisfaction. More good brutish Black Spike boys who would be a credit to the tribe of King Nobbler. Then he spotted Scarpa. He was smaller than the other hatchlings, with long ears, a mat of reddish hair, a ginger tuft at the end of his tail, and an odd light in his yellow eyes. Breslaw saw the way he hung back unnoticed in the corners of the cavern, as if he thought it might not be such a good idea to let other goblins swing large lumps of timber at his newly hatched skull. Breslaw rummaged through the heap of eggstone shards and picked up the still warm fragments of the stone which Scarpa had emerged from. Sure enough, thick veins of slow silver ran this way and that across its surface. Slow silver, the strangest and most magical of all metals. It shone like real silver, but you could knead it like putty, and when exposed to certain types of flame, it would burn with a strange fire. In olden times, great sorcerers like the Lich Lord had used it in their spells. These days, it did not seem much use for anything, but it was rare and valuable and shiny, and goblins loved rare, valuable, shiny things. Breslaw stuffed Scarpa's egg shards away inside his clothes before the hatchlings saw them. Later, he would prize out the slow silver and add it to the little ball of the stuff he kept in a secret place in one of his hiding holes in the walls of the hatchery. It was years since he found an egg stone with that much slow silver in it. From such a stone, long years before, Breslaw had hatched, and now he saw in young Scarpa another like himself, a goblin wiser and more cunning than the rest. I must keep an eye on this youngling, he told himself. Sure enough, Scarpa learned to talk much more quickly than his batch brothers, whom Breslaw had named Yabba, Gutgust, Bootle, Wrench, and Libnog. He was the only one who paid attention when Breslaw tried to teach them goblin lore. And while the others fought over food at mealtimes in the big, busy chamber called the Scoffery, Scarpa always found some way to spirit hunks of meat and cave mould cheese out from under their squabbling snouts, and carry it away through Black Spike's maze of passages and wobbly wooden ladders to some dark little disused room where he would eat alone, undisturbed and unobserved, except by Bresslaw, whose beady eye was on him always. One day, when a storm was racketing its way through the Bone Hills, and the rest of the tribe were all outside on the battlements, netting crows or hurling boulders and rude words at mad Armadacon's lads, Bresslaw found young Scarpa lounging in the scoppery. He was sitting in King Nobbler's own chair and nibbling leftovers from King Nobbler's own dinner. "What are you doing here?" the hatchling master demanded. "You should be out with the others. Boulders don't throw themselves, you know." Scarpa shrugged and popped a plump cave spider into his mouth. "It's raining up, down and sideways out there," he said. "Hailing too. It's warmer and drier in here, and while those idiots are busy, I can get close to the fire and eat." Bresslaw drew himself to his full height. He stood about 5'6", which was tall for a goblin, and his eyes glittered. No hatchling had spoken to a hatchling master like that since, well, he thought, not since he had spoken like it to his hatchling master, old Wheezing Bottom, more years ago than he cared to recall. So instead of screeching at the impudent young sprout and giving him a clout with his teaching mallet, he said, "Come with me, young Scarpa," and led him down the Black Spike's winding, wormy stairways to a half-forgotten chamber near the tower's foot. Thick skeins of cobwebs stretched and tore as Bresslaw heaved the door open. "Behold," he said, "the bum-wipe heaps." There were chambers beyond numbering among the labyrinths of Clovenstone, huge crumbling abandoned buildings crowded right up to the foot of the keep, and the goblin explorers who ventured out from Black Spike Tower didn't usually have to go very far before they discovered a stronghold or a storeroom that they'd never seen before. Some of those rooms were full of treasure, which could be looted and fought over, and carried up the stairways to King Nobbler. Others held mouldering curtains and tapestries, which could be turned into goblin clothes, or heavy old items of furniture, which could be used to make weapons, or weapons, which could also be used to make weapons, or pots and pans and cauldrons, which the Black Spike boys turned into armour. Still other rooms were home to colonies of fat black rats, which were always tasty, or the bones of men and goblins and other things from long ago, which could be gnawed or used to make nice ornaments, or weapons. But sometimes the goblins would come upon a locked chamber or a promising-looking iron-bound chest that, when opened, turned out to contain nothing but bundles of thin, white, crinkly stuff covered in little wriggly black marks. This they deemed useless. They'd found a lot of it in Black Spike itself, and it had all been thrown into a deep storeroom. Bum-wipe, the goblins called the stuff, and sometimes they helped themselves to a handful on their way to the poo-in holes, but mostly it lay undisturbed, for goblins seldom bothered about wiping their bottoms. It was to this storeroom that Bresslaw now led young Scarpa. There lay the bum-wipe in a great heap, with white worms burrowing through it, and the blind white bats of Clovenstone snoozing among the stalactites above, and scattering their luminous droppings over it so that the heap glowed with a sickly green light. It was 10 times as tall as Scarpa, and as smelly as King Nobbler himself. The lower levels had gone to compost, but on the top were mounds of books, papers, charts, letters, documents, and drawings. "What's all this, then?" asked Scarpa, who had never heard of any of those things. Bresslaw knew at once that he had been right to bring the lad there, because "what's all this, then?" was more interest than any other goblin had shown in these old things during all his time as hatchling master. He picked up a thick leather-bound book and scraped bat poo from its cover with a thoughtful claw. Opening it, he held it out to Scarpa. "See all them wriggly black things all over it? Them are what the softlings call lettuce," he said. "When you get lots and lots of lettuce strung together, it's called a worm. That's what all these are, worms. Because they look a bit like worms, I suppose, although they're black instead of white and you can't eat them. And when there are lots and lots of worms on lots of different sheets of bum-wipe, they stitches them all together and puts these leather flaps on the front and the back, and they calls it a birk. That's what these things be called, birks." He gave Scarpa the birk to hold and pulled a big furled-up sheet of bum-wipe out of the side of the heap. Unrolling it revealed a lot of spindly squiggles with worms written between them. "And this thing here be called a map," he said. "All these lines be pictures of things, see? It's like a picture of the whole hugeness of Clovenstone. When softlings lived here back in the oldie times, they used such maps to find their way about. Look," he said, pointing to a place near the map's centre. "Here's the old Black Spike." Scarpa peered closely at the lines and saw that Bresslaw was right. He recognised the spiky outline of Black Spike Tower, and next to it its neighbour towers. Redcap and Slatetop and Sternbrow, Natterden, Grimspike and Growler, with the inner wall stretching between them. Any goblin could have recognised the distinctive pointy outlines of those towers if they had taken the trouble to look, but apart from Breslau and Scarpa, none ever had, and none but Scarpa would have thought to do what Scarpa did next, which was to look at the squiggly black worms written on the map and think, the worms beside Slatetop and Sternbrow both start with that big squirrely mark. Sorry. And there it is again, in the middle of that worm next to the black spike. So maybe the squirrely mark means s, and maybe all them other marks mean different sounds. I wish I'd never laid eyes on that flaming map, wailed Scarpa, 2,000 feet above the ground and falling fast. But he had lit eyes on it, and that was how it had all begun. From then on, while the other goblins went birds nesting among Black Spike's turrets or practised fighting on its narrow ledges and crumbly battlements, Scarpa always found a way to slip off unnoticed and creep down to the Bunwhite Heap. There, by the glow of the luminous bat droppings which he smeared on his nose to light his studies, he pored over the mysteries of lettuce, worms, and birks. Before many moons passed, he had taught himself to read. Using the names on the old map as a key to help him work out the sound that each of the lettuce stood for. He had learned that the lettuce were really called letters, the worms were words, and the proper name for birks was books. There was even a book there called Dictionary, which held lists of words, with other words beside them explaining what they meant. From this, Scarpa learned the meaning of words which no goblin before him had ever known. Words such as kindness and gazebo. There were other books too, books which held whole stories, although sometimes their endings had been nibbled off by white worms, and even when they hadn't, Scarpa had no way of knowing which were true and which were false. I'm going to skip a little bit, because otherwise we're running out of time. So Scarpa basically gets cleverer than the other goblins, and he gets to be a bit of a know-all. In the end, he thought, as he plummeted towards the rocks, all that knowledge and learning had been his downfall. It was difficult when you knew so much not to try and explain things to people and set them right when they made mistakes, and that was not always a good idea. Tumbling over and over in the bitter gusts that roared up the face of the mountain, Scarpa recalled the previous night and the great mustering of the tribe that King Nobbler had called in the Scoffery. All the goblins of the tower had gathered there, from the mightiest warriors to the lowliest snot-infested hatchlings. Snot-infested? Snot-nosed hatchlings. The king, magnificent in all his armour, had stood on his special kinging chair in the firelight. King Nobbler was a giant of a goblin, almost as big as a man, which was how he had managed to make himself king in the first place. His craggy face was seamed with scars from countless raids and battles, and he wore a black patch to hide a missing nose. His fangs gleamed as he shouted, "Good news, boys! Tomorrow night, us lot are going to join up with Armadacon's lads and the chilly hats from Redcap and launch a great raid on the towers round the east side. We're going to sweep down on them east side mobs and kill them all and take their gold and silver and that. And you lot is going to be right at the fronts of things, the hammer of the Black Spike. We'll show Armadacon's lot and them Redcap pepperheads why King Nobbler's Black Spike boys is the best land pirates in all Clovenstone." And that was when Scarpa, with his head stuffed full of facts and words, raised his claw. King Nobbler saw the movement. It put him off his speech. He forgot what he'd been going to shout next. His angry golden eyes were drawn to Scarpa. He grunted and leaned forward, peering at this weedy little runt, whom he'd never noticed before, but who had done what nobody else had ever dared do, interrupt him. The firelight shone sharp on the spines of his armour and the tips of his tea-coloured fangs. "What?" he said. "There's no such thing as land pirates, Your Majesty," said Scarpa uneasily. He already sensed that he had made a mistake, but he could see no way back. The glow in the Goblin King's eyes deepened, as if a fire somewhere behind them was being stoked up. "We robs people," he said. "We smashes in doors and burns houses and kills people and comes home laden with loot. What is we if we ain't land pirates?" "Well, it's just that pirates generally work at sea," Scarpa explained. His voice got smaller and smaller as he spoke, but it was still easy to hear in the appalled silence that filled the king cave. "We're bandits, Your Royal Immensity, or brigands." "Brigands?" said Nobbler. Yes, Your Magnificentness. Brigand, noun, somebody who lives by plunder, usually as part of a gang of marauding thieves." The dictionary definition of brigand rocked the king back on his heels like a blow from a well-aimed warhammer. He didn't know quite what it meant, but it sounded like softling talk to him. Nobbler had no time for softlings. What did softlings ever do that was any good, he often asked his goblins. and roared the answer along with them. Nothing! Although actually, there was one softling invention that secretly impressed him. He admired the softling's underpants, so snug and comfortable and toasty warm. He'd stolen himself some very cosy pink flannel ones, extra large with frilly bits, which he wore at all times. To protect his bottom from the Black Spike's icy draughts and the hard seat of his kinging chair. Of course, he made sure they stayed safely hidden beneath his armour and his goat-hide trousers. It would never do to let his goblins see he wore pink flannel knickers. And it would never do to let himself be contradicted by a little half-grown runt like Scarper either. The Black Spike goblins only let Nobbler lead them, because they knew he'd dish out dreadful punishments to anyone who questioned him. He scowled at Scarper for a moment, trying to think of something suitably bad to do to him. Luckily, he didn't have to think very hard. The goblins of Black Spike Tower had an age-old way of dealing with impertinent, rebellious, or unwanted hatchlings. "To the Bratterpult!" roared King Nobbler. I suspect I'd better finish that.